speculate or hypothesize about the future prospect of developing countries in the world economy. Growth matters, I must stress, because it's cumulative. However, statistical projections based on an extrapolation of the recent past into the distant future, which Goldman Sachs have made fashionable, even if these are the fashions of our times, cannot predict outcomes. Such projections highlight the power of compound growth rates. But growth is not simply about arithmetic. In fact, it is about more than economics. And there's nothing automatic about growth. There are underlying factors which suggest a strong potential for growth, but there are also real constraints on future growth. In the ultimate analysis, the constraints can be overcome in a sustainable manner only if economic growth is transformed into meaningful development so that it improves the well-being of people. If this happens, I will argue that it would reinforce the process of growth and development through a cumulative causation as a virtuous circle. If this does not happen, developing countries will find catch-up difficult and will continue to lag behind the industrialized world. The economic determinants of potential growth in the developing world are a source of good news. And in principle, developing countries may be able to attain or sustain high rates of economic growth for some time to come for 4 reasons. First, their population size is large, which is a possible source of growth, and their income levels are low, which means that the possibilities of growth are greater. Second, their demographic characteristics, in particular the high proportion of young people in the population, which would mean an increase in the size of their workforce for some time to come, are conducive to growth, provided that developing countries spread education to create capabilities amongst these people. Third, in most developing countries, wages are significantly lower than in the world outside, which is an important source of competitiveness in manufacturing activities, while there are large reservoirs of surplus labor, which would mean that relatively low wages will continue to be a source of competitiveness for some time to come. Fourth, the potential for productivity increase at the earlier stages of development, we know both from theory and history, and the extensive margin is great, from almost zero productivity in agriculture to some positive, even if low productivity in manufacturing or services, followed by a transfer of such labor from low productivity employment in somewhat higher productivity employment at the intensive margin in manufacturing. In practice, developing countries may not be able to realize this potential for growth because of constraints that may differ across space or surface over time. It is obvious that there are specific constraints in different countries, whether leaders or laggards. There are also general constraints common to most developing countries, such as poor infrastructure, underdeveloped institutions, inadequate education, unstable politics, and just bad governance. In addition, there are possible constraints that may not be discernible so far, but may arise from the process of growth, such as economic exclusion, social conflict, environmental stress, and climate change. And there are some constraints that may be exogenous to developing countries, such as worsening terms of trade, restricted market access for exports, inadequate sources of external finance, or, as now, the crisis in the world economy. Now, in the pursuit of development, I believe that poverty eradication, employment creation, and inclusive growth are an imperative. For one, these are constitutive as the essential objectives of development. For another, these are instrumental as the primary means of bringing about development. This is the only sustainable way forward for developing countries because it would enable them to mobilize their most abundant resource, people, for the purpose of development. There is, of course, a complexity in the process of development, yet some initial conditions and essential foundations are almost obvious. The spread of education in society is an imperative, for it provides the essential foundations of development in countries that are latecomers to industrialization. Similarly, the development of an infrastructure, both physical and social, is an essential part of initial conditions that must be created in the earlier stages of industrialization. Most important, perhaps, there's a critical role for the state in terms of policies, institutions, and governance. Developing countries must endeavor to combine economic growth with human development and social transformation. This requires a creative interaction between the state and the market, beyond the predominance of the market model in the process of development, and their past could then be a pointer to their future. Thank you.